Hello and welcome to another Marvel Rivals video, and in this video we're going to be going over everyone's favorite moon-themed vigilante, Moon Knight. We'll be going over his full kit, including all of his abilities and how to best play him in Marvel Rivals. Now let's begin. For starters, we're actually going to be covering his movement abilities since I think they're the easiest to understand, and that's because they're pretty simple. For movement, Moon Knight has access to a double jump, glide, and grapple hook. You can use the double jump and grapple hook to get to the high ground or a good vantage point, or to make yourself a harder target to hit, which is always a good thing. Then you can use glide to get to a better position from the high ground or to get a more tactical view of the battleground. The only really important thing to note here is that his double jump and grapple hook both are on a cooldown. The double jump has a 6-second cooldown and the grapple hook has a 15-second cooldown. Moving on, let's get to the meat of every character, their abilities, starting with the primary fire. When pressing his primary fire, Moon Knight will throw 3 crescent darts forward, damaging enemies hit and bouncing between enemies or onks within range. That's a big theme in Moon Knight's kit, bouncing your crescent darts and hitting multiple enemies at once. Each of these darts deals 25 damage at max, so 75 damage if you hit your full burst, with damage fall off up to 50% at 50 meters. They can also bounce a maximum of 3 times with a damage fall off of 20% per bounce, which is important when figuring out how much damage you're going to be doing. The basic way you want to use his primary fire is hit an enemy that is close to another enemy, then watch them bounce between targets, dealing even more damage, and keep firing until everyone is dead. If you're just shooting at an enemy, the crescent darts will hit the first enemy, bounce and hit the second enemy, and then bounce back and hit the first enemy again. So if your enemies are grouped up, you're hitting more enemies and dealing more damage. You still deal insanely good damage in 1v1 situations, and you can take on a lot of 1v1s. Just be aware of and know that if you can, try to attack enemies that are grouped up, because you'll be increasing your damage output by quite a bit. And you'll be killing more things, and when you're killing more things, you're winning more fights, and when you're winning more fights, you're capturing the point and pushing the payload, which you gotta do to win. The other thing I want to note is that Moon Knight's darts are projectiles that have a travel speed and travel time. They move at 120 meters a second. So if you're attacking an enemy at range or a moving enemy, you're gonna have to lead your shots. This also means that certain enemies that can fly are a particular pain for Moon Knight to deal with, because you have to be extremely accurate with your shots to actually hit them, and the flying enemies are usually on their own, so you can't even really bounce your darts off of any enemies or your onks to hit them. It's not impossible to deal with an Iron Man or a Storm or another flying enemy, but you just have to be really accurate. His next ability, his right click or his alt fire, is Moonblade. Think of this as a single big crescent dart. You throw it out and it deals damage to enemies that you hit or that it bounces off of, which it can. It can bounce off of both enemies and onks, just like Moon Knight's crescent darts. It deals 80 damage, can bounce 3 times with 20% damage fall off per bounce, and it can critically hit on the first hit. So the first enemy you actually throw it at, if you do throw it at an enemy instead of an onk, you can actually get a headshot, which increases the damage and does quite a bit. So it's definitely worth trying to go for that headshot for that extra damage. As for this, anytime you can line up the shot or bounce it off an enemy and onk, just go ahead and use it. It does a whopping 80 damage and is just a good tool for finishing off low opponents or starting off a fight with a good chunk of damage just straight off the bat. Basically, the way I use this is if it's off of cooldown and you're attacking someone, you should be trying to hit your Moonblade, just for that big extra chunk of damage. For his final normal ability, we have probably his most important one, the Ancient Ankh. When Moon Knight presses this ability, he will launch forward an Ankh. When this Ankh hits the surface, it will pull in any enemies within a 5-meter radius and deal a small amount of damage, 20 damage to be exact. That's all the ability actually does. But the Ankh it leaves behind, actually on the battlefield, is what's important. Any crescent dart or moonblade you throw at the Ankh will bounce off of it and automatically hit any enemy within the Ankh's 7-meter radius. So basically, if an enemy is in the Ankh's radius, you don't need to hit the enemy at all. Just hit the Ankh and it will bounce off and hit the enemy automatically, 100%. Like I said earlier, Moon Knight's kit has a lot of bouncing. Basically, what you want to do is position your Ankh in a place where it's hard for the enemy to take out, but where you can hit it easily and where enemies are actually going to be walking into its radius. Because if no enemies are walking into its radius, it's not really going to be doing much. Think of the capture point, payload, or a choke point. Somewhere where there will be a lot of enemies grouped up for your darts to bounce around between enemies and your Ankhs. You can send an Ankh onto the capture point or someplace where you know the enemies will be, then unload into your Ankh and watch as your crescent darts and your Moonblade bounce between your Ankh and the enemies, just causing mayhem, racking up the damage, and just taking out people. Now it's important to note that Moon Knight's Onks can be destroyed, quite easily actually. They don't have a lot of health and 1 or 2 shots from basically any character can take them out. That's why where you position them is so important. Now of course where you should put them is based on the map, objective point, where the enemy team is heading. But if you're putting them where the enemy usually are or on the objective, you've got the right idea. Just experiment with your positioning and see what works for you, and just try out different things on different maps, and eventually you'll find out where you're racking up the most damage and what works and where the enemies aren't really getting to it. Finally, for his last ability, we have his ultimate, the Hand of Khonshu. When Moon Knight activates his ultimate, he will get to target an area. Once targeted, a portal will open up to the moon, and Hands of Khonshu will fall from the sky, dealing a ton of damage to any enemy within the ability's radius. Of course, there are a couple important things to note. For starters, the ability lasts for 3 seconds and deals 75 damage per hit, with the ability hitting 10 times total during its entire duration. I think his ult is pretty straightforward on how to use it. It's a big circle that deals a ton of damage to anything inside of it. Just wait for the enemy team to group up, or you can combo it with another ult from a friend and just annihilate anything within its radius. Now that we understand how all of Moon Knight's abilities work, let's go over some advanced strategies and how to best play Moon Knight. Moon Knight specializes in group damage, making him great against enemy comps that like to group up or play together, since all of his abilities bounce to damage multiple enemies or affect multiple enemies in a radius. Use a combination of your double jump, glide, and grapple hook to take the high ground. From here, you can see what your team and what the enemy team is doing. Then you can decide where to throw your Onks, which is your most important ability. If they're attacking a choke, throw your Onk around the edge of the choke, so if they push through, you can hit all of them by simply hitting your Onk. And if the enemy team wants to deal with it, they have to turn around to destroy it, putting their backs to you and your team for a second or two, which might not seem like much, but a lot can happen in those couple of seconds when they turn around to take out your Onk. If they're playing on the point, you can throw your Onk on point, then attack it from there to bounce and damage all the enemies. The radius of the Onk is about 7 meters, which isn't a lot, but it can take up a good portion of a lot of the control points. And if the enemy is too busy fighting you or your team, they're not going to be looking for and taking out your Onks, which lets you just load into them and damage them even more. That's something you should be doing. Use the chaos of team fights to slip your Onks in unnoticed. In team fights, there are a couple things you can do actually. The first are sneaky Onks. If the team fight is going all out, your enemies are going to be focused on taking out you and your teammates, not on your Onks. So, use the chaos of the situation to your advantage. Try to send your Onk out on the enemies. This will also pull them in and move them around to add a bit more confusion to the situation. Then unload on your Onk and deal your damage. Deal as much as you can before they leave the radius or destroy your Onk. Now, this doesn't always work, because sometimes you'll go up against a team that just ignores your Onks and you kind of get a free game, and sometimes you go up against a team where somebody will always be looking for your Onks no matter what. Or maybe your Onk got destroyed by an AoE ability that somebody popped in a panic. So when that fails, just shoot the tank. I know that sounds kind of dumb, but remember, your Crescent Darts and Moonblade bounce. So if you're unloading into the enemy tank, all those darts are bouncing off of them and hitting the weaker targets around them. I cannot tell you how many times I got a pick on a Jeff or a Cloak and Dagger, because during the team fight I was just unloading into the Hulk or Venom or the enemy tank, and all of my darts were just bouncing off of them and straight into the squishies, healing them. Now of course, if you can find a nice pick on a DPS or a support, take it. But in those dirty, like, scramble team fights, going straight for the tank and trying to melt the biggest target while at the same time taking out everyone around them is still a pretty good option. So before the team fight, you should pre-position your Onks and chokes or on the objective. And during team fights, you should try to slip in an Onk or shoot the tank so everything bounces and damages everything, or find a good pick on the flank. But what should you do in 1v1 situations? For me, that depends on who you're facing. Moon Knight is a projectile-based character, so some matchups he's going to have a harder time to deal with. Most notably, flying characters. Flying enemies are hard for Moon Knight to deal with because they're harder to hit with his projectile primary fire. They're typically not near any walls or floors to be pulled in by an Onk throw, and they're not normally near any other enemies for you to bounce darts off of. For all those reasons, flying enemies are definitely a bit of a counter for Moon Knight. Sure, if an Iron Man or Star-Lord pushes you, you might get the rare pick on them by shooting their tank and having your darts bounce, but honestly, unless you're super confident in your aim, you should probably let your other DPS handle them. This isn't to say you can't kill those characters, but with Moon Knight, I think your time is better spent laying into the grouped up enemies where you get most of your damage and making those picks. But as always, if you can do something about those flying enemies, go for it, do something. but yeah, they're definitely a bit of a problem for Moon Knight to deal with. For the other DPS and supports, you can win 1v1s with them pretty easily actually by using your Ankh. The strategy I like to use is to throw the Ankh straight at them and light up the Ankh before they can leave the radius. And when I say throw the Ankh straight at them, I mean try to hit them with the Ankh. And that's because the closer they are to the actual Ankh, like closer to the center, the more they are pulled into the center. So it's more of a stronger pull versus if they were at the edge of the radius. This usually gives you enough time to melt the squishy targets like the other DPS or supports, and it really puts the odds into your favor. It pulls them in so you know exactly where they're going to be. They're in the radius of your Ankh, so every attack you fire will 100% hit them, and you can move around as much as you want since the target you're hitting, your Ankh, is stationary, and stationary targets are easy to hit. And it gives the enemy a choice. They can keep shooting at you and try to kill you before you kill them, which is going to be hard because you can move around as much as you want and you can't miss since you'll be hitting your Ankh. Or they can try to take out your Ankh. If they shoot at you, you still have the advantage since, like I said, you can't miss since you'll be hitting your Ankh and they'll be in its radius. And if they shoot at your Ankh, sure, they might take it out, but the entire time you're shooting and hitting them and they'll be hitting your Ankh and not hitting you. It also makes hitting enemies like Spider-Man and Iron Fist that have a lot of mobility just way easier. It makes winning 1v1s against them possible. And there are two real counters to this strategy. The first are AoE attacks, because they can hit you and your Ankh at the same time, so characters with a quick panic AoE, like a Spider-Man ult or a Star-Lord ability, can shut you down pretty quickly. And of course, mobility, because a lot of good players are going to skedaddle the moment they get hit with that Ankh. So for that reason, it's really important to pay attention and keep track of cooldowns. I'm probably not going to win that 1v1 if I throw my Ankh out before I see if my target has their escape. So for that reason, watch and wait before you pick your 1v1s. Wait to see that Scarlet Witch or Spider-Man use their escape. Then, when you know it's on cooldown, when you know they don't have it, you can hit them with the Ankh and melt them before they leave its radius. Now for the final section of this guide, who does Moon Knight combo well with and who counters him? Moon Knight specializes in that group damage. So anyone that can group up enemies or keep them grouped up really works well with Moon Knight. So I'm talking about characters like Doctor Strange, Groot, and Jeff. And of course, he does have a team up with Cloak and Dagger where he can drop down an invisibility bubble, like a small bubble where if he stands in it, he's invisible, which is an okay team up. Honestly, it's alright. If you're going against a lot of hit scan characters or characters that need to be accurate to hit you, it's actually pretty good because you can sit in the radius and just kind of move around and deal damage. But the radius is small enough to where any enemies that have an AoE attack or an AoE ability can just nuke the entire bubble and hit you anyways. So the team up with Cloak and Dagger is okay, but you might as well use it because Cloak and Dagger is so good right now that you're probably going to have one in your match anyways. You might as well just use the team up when you have the opportunity. And now he's countered by anyone that likes to stay away from their team or fast characters that are hard to hit with his primary fire and Ankhs. So I'm talking characters like Black Widow, Hawkeye, who don't really group up, Iron Fist, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Storm, and Star-Lord, who are super mobile and harder to hit with Moon Knight's abilities. And that's going to be it for this video. I want to hear from you all. What do you think about Moon Knight? Who should I make a guide for next? And did I miss anything, or what can I do to make these guides better? I don't know, so let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this guide and want to see more, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more Marvel's Rivals gameplay and guides. Also, don't forget to check the description or pinned comment down below for a link to my Twitch channel and Discord server, where you can follow and watch me play live and join our community where I'm trying to get VOD reviews going and other types of community content going. So, yeah, if you're interested in any of that stuff, go follow those links, join, follow, do all that stuff. And yeah, I'm Zuliulix, and I'll see you in the next video.